Hello, everybody, and welcome again to Constellations Conversations with Nicola Dunn and me, Robert Rowland Smith. Hello, Nicola. Nice to see you.
Robert, nice to see you too.
And Nicola, when we were chatting before the red light of recording went on, we were talking about our subject for today, and it's mainly around, why train in constellations? What's the advantage of a training rather than just doing a constellation? So should we try and focus a bit on that then today and talk about some of the ins and outs of that? Maybe I'll just sort of kick off with where we were, in our chat, because I think the miracle of constellations and why I've always been so entranced by it right from the very start is that it always works, in the sense that you put a representative, in the field, and immediately they are able to report on the feelings they're picking up of whomever or whatever it is they're representing. So in that sense, it requires no skill at all. What I would call in management consulting speak, the barriers to entry to constellating are so low that you can, they're like the very smallest hurdle. They're barely a kind of bump on the floor. But my sort of feeling about this is that's fine, but kind of fools rush in where angels fear to tread in constellations, because yes, it's supremely available resource to more or less anybody. But once you step in as a constellator and have live people who have real issues and questions and feelings and doubts and anxieties and all the rest of it, you're operating in an environment where, yes, huge benefits can be reaped, but also damage can be done, I think, as well. So I think that's more or less what we're going to talk about, and therefore why it's probably a good idea to make sure you're pretty well trained before you even attempt it.
Yes, I think people perhaps fall into two groups. There are those that are what we call plungers, who kind of see something they like and they just dive in and think, well, I'll work it out on the way and I'll see what happens. And there are others who might feel a little bit more hesitant to kind of dive in and feel I need to be a bit better prepared and understand how the territory might lie. So, enthusiasm is good. Otherwise, nobody would ever kind of move forward to kind of expand the boundaries of constellations. But exactly as you say, there's a difference between being able to do a systemic map, which is to get a focus or intention from the client, and to, if you're doing this live, to set up some representatives and to get some data from the representatives. But the big question for most people is, what do you do after that? Because at that point, you've just got some data and you're not actually doing a constellation, you're doing a systemic mapping.
Yeah, I like that. And certainly what I've seen with, let's say, rookie constellators, there are a number of pitfalls, it seems to me. So just take the idea of a systemic map. Okay, you're my client, you're the seeker, you're the issue holder. We'll now set up your family system. So if we did a Constellations 101, whatever issue you give me, I'm going to set up you, your mum and your dad, and maybe your siblings and maybe your grandparents. So that would be the sort of Constellations 101. It's like, I'm not really tuning into your issue particularly, but I know that if I set up your family system, I'll get data, and therefore we'll have what you call a systemic map. And then certainly what I've seen is then the rookie constellator will go around each of the representatives eliciting a report, and you then have 8 reports or whatever, and there's a bit of a so what. And I think exactly as you say, there's, where do you go next with that? And I've certainly seen, rookie constellations then say, okay, well, then maybe we now need to bring in the great aunt and that line, or now that wasn't very conclusive, so let's bring in the generation behind, or let's put in death, sort of building a map kind of without a compass, if you like, I suppose is how I describe it.
Yes. And so I think out of a certain anxiety, a new constellator might just add, as you're saying, just extra representatives. So they're just increasing the diameter of the kind of concentric circles in the constellation. So what they're getting is more information about the problem and challenge, but there is not at this point any movement towards a solution.
Yeah.
Transformation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we're also going to talk about the first words that a client brings. I'll use the word client for now. And the first words, while they are significant, can also be a decoy as well. And I've certainly seen new constellators simply take at face value what the client is saying and set it up. And as a kind of analogy to that, I've certainly seen again and again representatives in a constellation kind of lobbying the constellator or advising them on who to bring in or what to leave out, or to say, you know, that person isn't trustworthy, they should go. And so the new constellator says, oh yeah, okay, well, why don't you sit down then? So the power shifts towards the representatives, who are obviously speaking only from their own position and wanting to generally secure it. So that's another aspect. I think, you know, constellators get wrapped up, you know, because the anxiety you mentioned, where shall I go next? They'll grab onto any clue that might be given to them, even if it comes from the representatives, who in a sense are the least reliable people of all, even though their data is pure.
Yes. And so we're talking about, you know, the degree a little bit to which you align with the client, the issue holder, the seeker's current version of the challenge. Now, if you completely just align with them, my question is, what do you offer them? Actually, not much. They're going to leave with what they came with.
Yeah.
So I think the point about a training is you, for a start, you get help to understand your own systemic blind spots, that you're not doing your own constellation from your own family of origin with every client that comes to you, because obviously that's not helpful either. Maybe useful for you, but not helpful for the clients. So you have a kind of an understanding of how to join with the client and yet still keep one foot on firm ground. So that the vista that you see is actually, because you haven't completely bought shares in their version of the story, you have a wider vista, which is more helpful to them.
Yes, it reminds me of a conversation I had with Mark Vernon, who's known to both of us, also a constellator and a psychotherapist, about the physical position at the beginning of a constellation of the constellator with the client. And typically you're sitting next to them, but both facing outwards, which is different from the face-to-face of psychotherapy or the couch and out of view situation of the psychoanalyst. And without going into too much detail about it all, I think the side by side with the client is a good representation of what you just described. I'm in alignment with this person, but I'm looking out, and so I'm not going to be hypnotized by their gaze as I might be, you know, in a psychotherapeutic face-to-face encounter. I might end up, you know, because we're primates basically, you know, we end up mimicking the other. If you see a group of people out for a drink in a pub, it's extraordinary how much mutual mimicry goes on when people are, you know, somebody laughs, somebody else laughs or whatever, somebody puts on a sad face, other people sort of echo it visually. So I think that's already quite a helpful visual dynamic for a new constellator to bear in mind, that, you know, I'm in the, or a bit like a driving instructor, you know, I'm in the seat next to you, but I've got some pedals just in case.
Yeah, beautiful. And another thing about doing some training is you get a peer group. You get feedback from peers and from whoever's training you. It's likely that any, you know, sort of errors you might make, you know, they're well-trodden paths. And so there are well-trodden solutions out of those sort of cul-de-sacs that you might find yourself in. So you get appreciation about what you're doing well, what you could do more of, and perhaps what you could do a little bit less of.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, people do say, I'm sure it's true, that you learn most from your peer groups, actually. So the teacher sets the frame, but because peer groups are more geared to your level, you can make those incremental steps, which are easier than the big steps that the teacher's kind of expecting from you. Yes, that's true. I also like this analogy of flying hours. You know, how many hours of running constellations do you need to have before you then go out in public? And actually, to pick up on the driving analogy again, some people need loads of lessons and some people only need a few, but that some people do need loads. And I remember I mean, we trained at the same time, Nicola, back in the 2000s, but I remember sorry, this sounds a bit like humble bragging or boasting, but I remember going to my first Constellations workshop in the year 2000, being blown away by it and thinking, I'm never going to train in this. My God, it's so complicated and whatever. But I kept going and found myself drawn in further and further and thought, okay, this was after about 5 years of going to quite a lot of workshops. I thought, okay, I'm going to train. And we did the training. But even after the training, I said to myself, I'm only going to do this tentatively and just in organizational settings for a few years. And it was several years actually before I started expanding, because my feeling was, this is, you're sort of carrying a Ming vase around with you, when you're a constellator, and people do get upset or can get upset if you bring in the wrong things or don't handle their issues sensitively. So obviously we're both huge advocates for training, and I think it's not least because of that risk factor that you need those flying hours.
Yes, and you need support in the flying hours.
Yeah.
I think, why would someone train? I think if you're enthusiastic about it and if you feel, actually, this has touched me deeply, I feel I resonate with it, then, why not explore it further? You can normally do a foundation training and you can decide whether you do the second year plus in order to sort of have a more professional approach. But I think even understanding how the principles work can save really anybody quite a lot of challenge. Because, as we know, there are some universal guidelines that operate in systems, whether that's family, whether it's teams, whether it's the workplace. And actually really having a deep understanding of that is a very powerful kind of life resource.
Yes, exactly. And maybe again in another episode we'll talk about those principles in orders that underpin things. But I think you've touched on something there I think is very helpful. So the other benefits I think of a training are that it takes the element of guesswork out of the constellator's practice. Instead of thinking, oh, there's the mother, maybe she's a bit traumatized, let's try getting her to say a sentence, I'm traumatized, which is a bit like, we were joking earlier, it's sort of pin the tail on the systemic donkey. You're sort of you're just trying out different things in the hope that one of them hits the mark. What the orders do is at least reduce the possibility or take some of the randomness out of the choices you're making as a constellator, and bring a sense of methodology, I suppose, to what you're doing. I mean, I think that also changes later, as you become more experienced as a constellator, you can relax a bit and you can experiment a bit, but from a very different place. It's not stab in the dark stuff. It's like, okay, I've seen this several times now. I've got a feeling that we might be going in this direction, so I'll try that.
Because a training is giving you the theory, the guiding principles, and it is also supporting you to be open to what is arising in the moment. Because it's the combination of those two which is really the alchemy of facilitating a constellation. And in a sense, you start off in the shallow pools. It's a bit like learning to swim. The water is below your knees, and you're able to cope with that. You normally are given exercises to practice with that are specifically a little bit structured, so it reduces the number of elements that you're dealing with. So you're learning more about the water than the number of people in the swimming pool.
That's very nice. Yeah, I mean, exactly that. I mean, it's a safe environment to practice in, essentially, isn't it? I mean, I remember one of our trainees in the past saying, once you're doing constellation for real clients, you're working with live ammo, and and you're not in the training, and that's a very good thing, because nobody's going to blame you too much. We know the rules. It's being held. There's a contract there. Nobody's going to get hurt, basically. So I think that is a critical point. It's a sort of it's a laboratory, and people have their protective glasses on.
Exactly. And to be honest, in that laboratory, you often learn more from your kind of, we want to call it mistakes or errors or missteps, than you do from the moments that flow well. Because I think on a personal level, as a constellator, if you make a misstep, it's an ouch moment. And, and they think, oh, okay. And there's a sort of a sense, perhaps you can discuss that with peers or with your trainer about kind of what happened in that moment, and even understand yourself a bit better as a constellator.
That's nice. I hadn't really thought about that aspect, but it is key, isn't it? There's an awful lot of self-knowledge that can be generated through a training, because you notice when you get anxious to provide the solution, or to be clever, or to say that phrase that unlocks everything. Maybe this is more of a male trait, I don't know, maybe not, but because there is this sort of miraculous environment you're in, I think there is a sort of implicit burden of being a kind of miracle worker in the miraculous environment, whereas I think it's quite nice to think of yourself as a kind of engineer who's stumbled into a miracle environment, and your role is really just to respect it and tune it and do your best job, and then to go away again and maybe come back and tune it again. But actually it's quite a kind of humble role in a way.
I agree, because when the constellation ends, the role goes away.
Yeah.
And the constellation leaves with the client. So you were privileged to participate in something as a constellator, and that is part of the alchemy. But it's not about you, and it's not about your personality.
Yeah.
And making those sort of very fluid transitions are something that you learn, obviously, through a training as well. And in a way, not to say that it takes away the mystery of constellations, but it introduces, as you're kind of saying, really kind of deep professional respect for the mystery.
Yeah. And I think also the training, certainly the students that we've had together, I think it helps them clarify what their intention is anyway. I mean, because some people arrive thinking, I'm going to be the world's best constellator, but then sort of think, well, maybe not. Maybe I can just add this to my practice as another, feather in my cap, for example, or maybe it is just a self-development thing, and that's fine,
Yes.
Yeah.
And it does, I would say, somehow aligns, understanding constellation work aligns with understanding creativity and creative forces. So whatever information comes available to you is exactly, I'm imagining, what comes available to people who are in a creative process, with artists to write or whatever. And so there's quite a lot of synergy between those two worlds. So
yeah, I like that.
Creatives who come for that reason is that they somehow, understanding that mysterious process and the forces that support it.
Yeah, I really like what you say there. And it does give you that possibility to be creative, well, really to explore in unknown territory, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
I like that a lot. I'm just thinking, Nicola, we should probably begin to draw things to a close in a second. But it might be worth just saying, because we've spoken about training, and that's been our focus in this thing, what training kind of looks like, I suppose, that might be helpful for some people, just in case they are thinking about training themselves. And I know, you and I have designed trainings in the past, and you do more than I do, actually. But I think it's the key thing to say is probably it is theory and practice that you get in a good training. There is lots of peer learning as well. You would learn about underpinning orders and systems. You may get some kind of deeper learning about the history of psychoanalysis or Gestalt or whatever. You would get to play the different roles, both the client role, constellator role, the representative role, and feel the difference as you move between these things. You'd also get to break down into micro chunks the different phases of a constellation, you know, from the very moment a client draws breath in the circle, you know, right to what's called the resolution or the debrief or whatever. So it's quite forensic, certainly the way we've done it. So I think those are kind of some of the main elements.
Absolutely. And you know, we're really saying principles, practice, and your own presence.
Yes, 3 Ps, exactly.
And so you know, the principles I think are essential. I think you need to know them, you need to embody them in order to sort of allow a space where you forget them, which I know is ironic, but it's a sense that you have all the theory, but you don't have to be limited by it, because then another space opens up around all the theory.
Yeah.
So you've got the theory, you're open, you know about phenomenology, and you can see the data arising from the space in front of you when you're doing the constellation. You can feel your own presence. So your kind of personality, it's present, but it's a little bit out of the way. I mean, it's not a constellation is not driven by the personality of the constellator, because otherwise then you're just getting the kind of little Nicola and little Robert, and you actually something a bit more expansive. So it's a skill to learn. It's a skill to learn how to be with a group, to be with them, but to hold the position of the constellator, which is different and separate, as you said. And I think people initially get experience as representatives and they get really interested in constellations. They then get experience of being an issue holder or seeker because they become more interested. And then just taking that third step to holding the other space of being a constellator really kind of completes a kind of perfect triangle in your kind of knowledge, your enthusiasm for the work. So it is, trainings are trainings, but they also, to be honest, they expand the individual who goes on it. I mean, I've never had anyone who has come to a training who hasn't left with a lot kind of more in their saddlebags probably than they first came. And so there's something very beautiful in training, because it is kind of crucible that is created by this group being together who travel together.
Yeah. Well, that's beautifully said. I don't want to add anything to that, because by adding, I might take away. So that's very nice. Principles, practice and presence. Brilliant. Okay, Nicola, shall we draw a line there on this subject? And I'll see you again online soon for our next episode.
I look forward to that, Robert.